Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining today. We welcome you to this event that is part of G-Local 2023. We are delighted to have each and every one of you joining us from on the comfort on your screens. My name is Gabriela Renteria Flores, and I'm the chair of Evil Youth Global Network, and I'll be your host for this engaging and insightful event. Before we begin, let me take a moment to introduce today's agendas. We will have carefully curated a lineup of amazing speakers who will be sharing their knowledge and experience on various aspects of culturally responsive evaluation. But also, I would like to mention that this event is part of the celebrations around IAG at 50, and we'll also announce a competition that we'll tell you a little bit more later. But first of all, what is like? I would like to before we start, let's go quickly some over housekeeping rules to ensure a smooth presentation. Please ensure that your mic is muted through the webinar and minimize your background noise and distractions. If you have any questions during the session, please use the chat or the Q&A. And this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available to every one of you. We encourage you to engage in meaningful discussions in the chat and connect with other people. And well, today's agenda is we'll be having Dugan Fraser as providing us some opening remarks. Then we'll have some presentations by our guests. And finally, we'll have some discussion, a moderated discussion. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll be answering at the end of the session. But now we'll be hearing a lot on culturally responsive evaluation. What is culturally responsive evaluation? I'll just give you a very brief introduction. This is an approach to evaluation that really emphasizes the importance of considering cultural context and diversity when we're conducting evaluations. It recognizes that the culture plays a significant role in shaping the experiences, beliefs, and values and behaviors, and acknowledge that into the evaluation process. The primary goal of this approach is to ensure that evaluations are inclusive, equitable, and respectful of cultural identities and perspectives. So without further ado, let's start. Well, I'll welcome Dugan Fraser. Dugan is a program manager of the Global Evaluation Initiative. Previously, he was the director of the CLEAR Center in Anglophone Africa at the University of Witwatersrand. And as an independent consultant, he supported organizations to collect and use evidence for decision-making, including design interventions, monitoring and performance, assessing results, and supporting strategy and program planning. Welcome, Dugan. Over to you.
Thanks, Gaby, and it's a real pleasure to see everyone here for what I know is going to be a very valuable exchange on culturally responsive approaches to evaluation. The theme of CRE is especially relevant to the GEI because it addresses many of the questions that we focus on as we work to promote and support the development of evaluation systems that are country-owned and aligned with local needs, goals, and perspectives. Culturally responsive evaluation raises questions about how we evaluate, the knowledge and values that guide our approaches, and the standards we use to determine value. But it also raises questions about who is empowered to do evaluations and who they listen to when they perform them. The different experiences you're going to hear today will make it clear to you that there's no single or simple answer to how to do culturally responsive evaluation. All of the answers are part of a collective effort to answer the overarching question of how to make evaluation more relevant and more inclusive. GEI is based on the idea that harnessing on-the-ground experience, knowledge, and the relationships of the huge network of partners will help build approaches that are reflective of local needs and that provide the kind of evidence that will really guide and inform decision makers. Obviously, this last part is crucial because tackling the questions raised by culturally responsive evaluation will also help address some of the other major include the lack of evaluation capacity, the lack of a cadre of evaluation professionals, and especially the lack of evaluation uptake. We all share the vision of evidence from evaluation helping to inform better decisions and ultimately improving lives. But really, that can't happen if no one's listening. So how do we get people to listen? This is going to require adapting global knowledge to local contexts and integrating evaluation approaches with the rhythms and the cultures of public institutions that do evaluation in a way that resonates with government decision makers and delivers evidence that is both meaningful and useful to them. I'm speaking to you tonight from the Solomon Islands, and the Pacific culture has such a particular way of thinking about evaluation that is really inspiring. So this will all require evaluators who are fully cognizant of their local context, who at least have an appreciation for the culture and history of the country. It'll require evaluators who can see the different strands of the fabric that make up a society and who can engage with a broader range of community voices, including those who often or even usually get marginalized. The concept of culturally responsive evaluation helps act as a roadmap for addressing questions about relevance and inclusion, but it also raises questions about who might be best placed to follow them. And so I'm really pleased to welcome the young and emerging evaluators who've joined us today, including one of our panelists, Dr. Mercy Fandadzo, who I'm very proud to say was a member of the first cohort of GEI's new hands-on learning program for young and emerging evaluators. Emerging evaluators from developing countries have first-hand experience of what can be the gap between global and local knowledge. Emerging evaluators also bring a distinct perspective that can offer new and innovative approaches to bridging that gap and realizing the opportunities of culturally responsive evaluation to generate more relevant evidence that stands a greater chance of informing better decisions and contributing to improved outcomes and ultimately to well-being. So the big announcement that I'm going to be making this evening is to announce a competition that we're launching together with our partners, Eval Youth, and I'm calling them our partner, but they're really our mothership, the independent evaluation group of the World Bank. And this competition is going to be focusing on culturally responsive evaluation. It's a call for papers from young and emerging evaluators on leveraging the potential value of culturally responsive approaches to evaluation in developing countries. You can follow the link that's being posted in the chat for more details on the competition. Just note that the competition is part of the activities that are being undertaken to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the decision to establish an independent evaluation function at the World Bank Group. Along with evaluating the development effectiveness of World Bank policies, programs, and projects, the independent evaluation function of the World Bank Group, the Independent Evaluation Group, was also focused on building evaluation capacity of partner countries. Encouraging and supporting young and emerging evaluators is a vital part of that mandate. And so it's really central to the missions of both GEI and Eval Youth. The finalists in the competition will all have their work published on the Better Evaluation website, and it'll be promoted by the GEI, by Eval Youth, and on IEG platforms. The winners of the competition will be invited to the World Bank headquarters in Washington, DC, to present their paper at one of the events dedicated to the anniversary, which is kind of being called IEG at 50. We see today's event as only the beginning of this process, and we hope that it's going to inspire many of you to join the competition and submit a paper. That's enough from me. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today. Back to you, Gaby.
Thanks a lot, Dugan. Thanks a lot for this great news. We hope that many young and emerging evaluators participate. And now we have the presentations of 3 young and emerging evaluators or former young and emerging evaluators who will be sharing their perspectives on culturally responsive evaluation. And I would just want to take 1 second to congratulate Rai, one of our speakers. As I've heard, it's her birthday today. So Rai, happy birthday. Hope you enjoyed this webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's lovely to be part of this on my birthday. Yeah, thank you.
And now we are going to introduce our speakers. First, we'll have Dr. Mercy Fenazzo, as Dugan said. She is part of the first cohort of the hands-off learning program of GI or GI internship, and Dr. Mercy is currently a program administrative officer at the CLEAR Center in Anglophone Africa. She's involved in evaluations, capacity strengthened projects, and research, and then she holds a PhD in environmental health, a master in monitoring and evaluation, and a bachelor in development studies from 3 different universities in South Africa. Welcome, Dr. Mercy. Over to you.
Is wonderful. I'm just going to go straight into my presentation. And a lot of information.
Mercy.
So I am.
Pardon me.
Yes.
You're having some audio issues. Perhaps if you I just wanted to let you know you're having some problems with your audio. It may be a bandwidth issue. So perhaps if you want to turn your camera off, that may assist. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. I'll do that. Is it any better?
Yes, it is at this moment.
Okay, thank you so much. So I was saying that I think a lot of work has been done, and we have we've heard a lot about having to actually embed culture into our evaluation so that we can address the needs of our continent. So I'm going to be specifically just focusing on the things that we are doing in Africa in terms of embedding culture into evaluations. To improve impact on the society and the communities of our own region. I think we can move on right into my presentation. So I think, from this region, what we have done is we have done a lot in terms of just accepting that there is need to embed culture, there is need to take into consideration cultural aspects when designing, implementing, and also evaluating programs, because it is very important if we are to actually change if we are actually to address the needs of the people on the ground. So I think during this week, a lot has been said in terms of the Made in Africa evaluation, which is actually a unique African approach to transform evaluation to address the regional needs, like I said. And it was birthed in the 1990s. So whatever the approaches that I'm actually going to be talking about, I could actually just, mention them as sub approaches, because they sort of like fall under Made in Africa evaluation as the umbrella approach that we are actually adopting in Africa. And the Made in Africa evaluation gained momentum at the 2012 Bellagio conference, championed by the AFRIA. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the underlying principles of MAE are that ownership of evaluation practice should be by the Africans who really understand the issues that they are going through. So in terms of evaluations, we understand that, or we acknowledge that evaluations have to be done by the Africans themselves, because they know what needs to be changed, what needs to be addressed, and what needs to be considered. They know what is important for them to achieve the impact that is required or that is necessary. And then evaluation theory and practice should be context-based and relevant to address Africa's needs. The other underlying principle that is very important to us is that Africa's knowledge systems and practices should be recognized and embedded in evaluations if we are to achieve the required impact. Development of skilled African scholars and practitioners for commissioning and utilization of evaluations evidence is key for us to achieve Made in Africa evaluation. Next slide. So what I've done is I've just taken notice of some approaches that are being used to embed culture into evaluations that I'm going to just be speaking through in terms of what is being done, what are people doing, what are evaluators doing in terms of embedding culture. That includes least indigenized approach, which is dominated by the Western evaluation theory and practice with minimum changes to contextualize evaluation. So in this case, you see that there's a lot that is being done in terms of adapting tools or adapting data collection methods and tools to actually make sure that we collect the quality data that will need to be used to implement programs or to improve programs in the future. So there's limited benefit for the communities because they are not necessarily involved in the design, but there's some minimum changes that is being done to contextualize the data collection tools or the approaches. And this means that limited efforts are being put by evaluators for indigenizing the methods of data collection. You find that in such methodologies, there is translating of data collection tools into languages, like for an example, local language that I've experienced it, where you just need to make sure that when you go to the ground, you find the right people to talk to and you use the right language. And we already see that there are limitations in terms of what evaluations can do because you don't have control in terms of how you can collect data besides having to actually localize the language so that people will understand. But the main purpose of doing this is to solicit information from the community about the kind of intervention that they needed in a language that they can understand. I think that's basically what we can say is really happening on the ground in terms of indigenizing our approaches. But you will see when I talk about the challenges, the limitations that this approach has on us. Next slide. There's also what we call adaptive or integrative evaluation approach. So these I've identified from literature, and these are actually the approaches that are being used or that are being researched by African evaluators in terms of just pushing forward my agenda. But you find that some of the things they are actually just trying to, it's just trying to actually find some control in terms of evaluations, and also just to improve the quality of data that is being collected. So this approach involves evaluators integrating Western and African methodologies, and they place equal value on both. The African cultures and communities are critical in these evaluations. They are considered as active evaluators. So the community members are considered as active evaluators to promote validity and usefulness of evaluation outcomes and societal change. Realist, participatory, or theory-based evaluation can be adapted to better suit the African context in which they are utilized. So there is a lot of adaptation that is taking place in terms of the methodologies. But of course, yes, realizing that it's Western and African methodologies that are being integrated. And then this involves the use of, for an example, indigenous knowledge systems, African peer review mechanisms, and community talks just to find consensus and to agree on issues as communities will be engaging in such activities. Next slide. The other one is actually an African relational-based evaluation approach, which values the use of an evaluation practice that is completely based on indigenized African evaluation conceptual frameworks, which acknowledges African cultures, languages, values, and knowledge systems. So literature shows that this approach has been adopted by some evaluators. Of course, some use mixed methods evaluation and transformative participatory mixed methods, which also have got their own limitations in terms of, having to spend time in the field with community members, depending on funding, depending on who is commissioning the evaluation, and depending on the time that is available for us to be able to achieve what needs to be done, and also the resources that are available for such evaluations. Next slide.
Mercy, you have
Yes.
1 minute, please, Rob.
1 minute. Okay, so I think what I could say is the common approach that is being used for embedding culture is knowledge sharing innovations. And here I'm talking about most of the things that CLEAR has done in terms of pushing forward the My Agenda. For an example, I think knowledge sharing innovations include African Evaluation Association, AFRIA, African Evaluation Database, AFRED, African Evaluation Indaba, and Made in Africa Special Collection, where information is being shared in terms of reports and guidelines and methods and practices that are being done to push forward the My Agenda. So you find that most of actually what I can say is the main approach for now that I've really seen that it's actually working is just pushing forward the agenda using information and different platforms that people can access different approaches and methodologies. Next slide. Curriculum development as well. CLEAR has contributed a lot in terms of just developing curriculum on decolonizing evaluations and delivering training, and also being commissioned in terms of those who would need training, those who would need curriculum that actually speak to Made in Africa evaluation. But I think in conclusion, what I can say is we are having a lot of challenges in Africa because given the background that we don't own most of the interventions, we don't fund our own interventions, you'll find that we have little control in terms of what we can achieve. And I feel that evaluation has not to be taken in isolation. We need to actually come up with a holistic approach to improving impact on the level of communities, on the level of individuals and institutions. And we need to come up with ways of having to engage in multi-stakeholder engagement so that we can find solutions for ourselves, because it seems like evaluation, Made in Africa evaluation, though it can achieve some results, but it's limited in terms of how impact can be achieved at the local level. I think if my time is up, I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Mercy. I'm sorry for we only have 7 minutes per speaker, because then at the end we can still explore a little bit more and people can ask you questions. So please, if anyone is having any question, please put it in the chat and then we'll answer it at the end. Now I would like to welcome Claudia Olavarria, and Claudia is a sociologist from the University of Chile. She has a master's in gender, society, and politics by Flaxo, Argentina, with a diploma in gender studies. Her area of expertise is methodological design applied to the evaluation field, with a special focus in collaborative and participatory approaches. Claudia has worked as a consultant in teaching, planning, and evaluation for 13 years. And she's actually an active member of several national and international networks, and she's the former co-chair of Evil Youth LAC. So welcome, Claudia. Over to you. I'll just remind you that we have a short time of 7 minutes.
Many thanks, dear Gabby. Please confirm that you can see my presentation.
Yeah, we see it.
Okay. So good morning and good evening to colleagues from other time zones. Greetings from an early morning in Latin America. From Chile, I am Claudia Olavarria, as Gabby just said, an evaluator and consultant, mostly in capacity development for evaluation. Many thanks for the invitation to be part of this very relevant space that's held during such a vibrant week for knowledge exchange. It's an honor, and I'm very happy and overall challenged to be after the presentation of Mercy and Dugan. I was invited to share with you today a regional perspective about a matter that's very relevant to me and to our community. That's the way we, as an evaluation community from Latin America and the Caribbean, are approaching culturally responsive evaluation practices to embrace the challenges and opportunities that evaluation faces on this region. This is a very challenging task, and I will do my best to respond to your expectations. What I'm sharing with you today is very brief, and it's a set of reflections from my own evaluation practice, especially in capacity development for young and emerging evaluators, that we do many reflections about what is important to evaluate in a rigorous manner and in a responsive manner to many contexts as culture, as well as very important inputs that were collected from a debate held in the RELAC conference in November 2022 in Quito, Ecuador, in which the evaluation community from Latin America and the Caribbean, unfortunately mostly Spanish-speaking Caribbean, discussed very deeply and meaningfully, if you ask my impression about it, about evaluation from Latin America and the Caribbean and for Latin America and the Caribbean, and what this means and what it should mean in order to improve lives, as Dugan just was saying before. And in this space, the community debated about ontological, epistemological, and methodological aspects of this evaluation practice and our dream for evaluation from Latin America and the Caribbean. Please notice that what I'm sharing with you today, it's a culturally responsive evaluation, but culturally responsive evaluation as at the crossroad of it with other well-related evaluation approaches that have framed my own practice and the practice of our community, I would also say, as feminist evaluation, as transformative evaluation, as participatory evaluation, among others. So we're not speaking exclusively regarding culturally responsive evaluation. Okay, to start, it is very important that we can locate ourselves into this territory. So let me welcome you, those of you that are not in this side of the world, to Latin America and the Caribbean. Please be aware that this region is wide and diverse. And this diversity is expressed in every Andean, Caribbean, Amazonic community, to name just a few. According to CELADE and the World Bank, more than 665 million people live here, just as I do and Gabby does. 42 millions are part of more than 800 indigenous cultures, which speak 560 indigenous languages. Moreover, 156 million of the people that live in this part of the world are young, between ages of 15 and 29. And 20% of us, or nearly 20% of us, are living in rural areas, as myself. Why is this data relevant? It's very important to get a sense of the scope and the depth of the cultural expressions that therefore the importance of the use of a culturally responsive approach to apprehend this richness and the complexity related to this diversity and its richness. Always thinking about using rigorous enough procedures, methods, and approaches that would allow us to really apprehend, as I told you, this richness. So could we use the same lens to look at these very different contexts, at these very different populations, at these very different communities? Certainly not. From a regional to a subnational perspective, political and institutional systems are crossed by shared beliefs and practices that filled all our work with meaning. So can we as evaluators ignore these meanings once we approach to an evaluand that's set in different cultural contexts? Certainly not. As evaluators, we must be able to capture those meanings with appropriate methods, approaches, and I would like to add intended uses. So what is the role of evaluation and of us as evaluator in this scenario? In Latin America and the Caribbean, as the rest of the world, is facing multiple coexisting crises. that slower a path to achieve sustainable development and affects the fulfillment of human rights of population, especially those that are most marginalized. Evaluation practice then in this scenario can and should be transformative or transformational in terms of providing evidence that sustains the required path to achieve social justice and the fulfillment of human rights. So evaluation needs to provide that evidence that's relevant enough and pertinent enough to let us know what are the best decision-making towards sustainable development. But for evaluation to be transformational, on my own view, some quality criteria must be met. Again, in an ontological, epistemological, and also in a methodological perspective. So being responsive to culture, and by this being responsive to context, to gender systems and relations, to power dynamics, to complexity, among others, is very key to value any intervention in a rigorous way and to provide evidence that will be relevant for that decision-making. But how can this be done? And these are just some very simple tips from Latin American practice and from those conversations that I told you we had. First, you must be aware of your own positioning and question your own assumptions, always. So be ready to look at your own practice critically. Study and understand the history and the culture of each place in which you're doing your work. Know and use local approaches. In our case, Latin American and Caribbean approaches are very rich towards research and also evaluation. Be innovative and be flexible and be ready to change the designs you already had once the new opportunities arise. Build a perfect evaluation team. And by this, I just mean diverse, sensitized, local, and hopefully with lots of young people. Be feminist, think intersectional, and be aware of power dynamics. Collaborate, stimulate meaningful participation of right holders, and by this empower, develop capacities, and help install those conversations that are needed towards transformation. And overall, listen. That's all on my side. Many thanks for your attention and looking forward to your reactions.
Thanks a lot, Claudia. And thanks a lot for the time. It was right on time. And now welcome Rai Singh Gupta. Again, happy birthday. And Rai is an international M&A consultant with over 4 years of experience in monitoring and evaluation, policy research, and data analysis. She has worked with government, private consulting, and multilateral organizations in that position. Rai has a master's in evidence-based social intervention and policy interventions from the University of Oxford, where she studied fully funded program. She also holds a degree in economics from Ram College of Commerce, University of Delhi. And Rai currently works as a senior monitoring and evaluation consultant at ECRIS London. Welcome, Rai. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for that warm welcome. It is a pleasure to be part of this panel, and coincidentally falls on my birthday, so it's a lovely way to spend that day as well. It's been wonderful hearing the presentations of the esteemed speakers right before me and learning about perspectives from Africa, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. And I'm here to provide a little bit of insight of how potentially culturally responsive evaluations can take place in the South Asian context, because that's largely the area in which I have worked. So without further ado, I'm just going to quickly, I've already shared my screen and I hope everybody can see my screen. That's all right.
Yes, it's perfect.
Great, lovely. So I just put together a presentation that essentially focuses on 2 case studies. One is from Myanmar and one is from India, which is based on 2 evaluations that I myself have conducted. And because Myanmar and India, while belonging to the South Asian context, are very different culturally, are very different socio-economically, we had to adopt certain different approaches to be able to conduct it in a manner that was equitable, in a manner that was culturally responsive, in a manner that the evidence that was generated was useful and relevant from a policymaking perspective as well. So in terms of structure of the presentation, we'll first focus on the Myanmar case study, which is in the context of nutritional programming. I'll then move on to the case study of India, which is in the context of rural development programming. And then I'll just have a quick slide on the key takeaways from the session. So just diving in straight into the first case study, this was an evaluation of a maternal and child cash transfer program, which was conducted in Myanmar in the Chin and Rakhine states of Myanmar, which was commissioned by UNICEF. And I was one of the 3 technical team members who was part of this evaluation. So a quick snapshot of the context in which we were working. This was a program that was being implemented, the cash transfer program in the Chin and Rakhine states of Myanmar. Of course, Myanmar is a country wherein, and this was around 2019 to 20, Myanmar is a country wherein about a third of children suffer from chronic malnourishment, and Chin and Rakhine are particularly underdeveloped regions in Myanmar suffering from poverty and malnourishment. Since its independence in 1948, of course, Myanmar has been afflicted by ethnic clashes, with it having one of the longest running armed conflicts in the world. And the program which we were looking to evaluate, this was a formative evaluation. The program that we were looking to evaluate was a maternal and child cash transfer program, also called the MCCT program, which provided a cash transfer of $10 to all pregnant and lactating women in the 2 states of Chin and Rakhine. These benefits would continue till the child reached 24 months of age, thereby covering the crucial first 1,000 days of life. And the purpose of this cash transfer was so that the mothers would use that amount to further the nutritional outcomes of their children, to buy healthy food for their children. It was also accompanied by certain awareness sessions by village level midwives who would kind of talk to the mothers and the pregnant and lactating women about what they could potentially spend that money on. So this was the overall context of the program which we were looking to evaluate. However, this was not without challenges, and that's when the culturally responsive part of it comes into action. When we're looking to evaluate such a program in such a context, there are several challenges that come into play. First of all, it was important to remember that this evaluation took place across 2 very diverse regions. Chin state, which was highly mountainous, difficult to reach, difficult to travel to, and then the Rakhine state, which had its internally displaced persons camps and which had its own security protocol and issues as well. Each of these areas had their own cultural nuances and linguistic diversity, which had to be accounted for in data collection and in analysis. Apart from that, it was also important for us to remember as evaluators that there are sensitivities surrounding childbirth, there are sensitivities surrounding feeding, child nutrition, that vary from culture to culture. And when a program sort of told the women what to spend that money on, even if through awareness sessions, it was important to understand how we could potentially evaluate the effectiveness of such a program. Further, in the context of most South Asian cultures, what we realized was that these are very community-driven, wherein it was important not only to interview the women who were receiving the cash transfers or the awareness sessions, but also their neighbors, also community influencers, also relatives, also friends who were important determinants of maternal and child nutrition. And above all of this, sitting above all of this was the fact that we were working in a situation of armed conflict, wherein certain groups would likely be more marginalized than others, certain voices would be more silenced than others. So that was something we had to keep in mind as well. So how did we potentially make this evaluation more culturally responsive and perhaps more equity-driven? I'm just going to provide some practical strategies we applied. Of course, all of these may not directly be transferable to other evaluations across the world, but may provide some kind of insight into what worked in the context of Myanmar, and some points may be transferable or some elements may be transferable in a different form to other evaluations as well. The first thing that we did, of course, and this is something that perhaps applies to ideally all evaluations across the world, is that it was a very ethical and human rights focused evaluation, which was reflected in the guiding principles that were followed. It was reflected in the training of enumerators and the inclusion of excluded groups in the sampled areas. We realized that the socio-cultural structure we were working with was excluding certain groups from even accessing the surveys or the interviews, and we had to take special care to ensure that those groups were included within the sampling process. So that's something we followed through an ethics and human rights centered approach. We also worked with a lot of local enumerators. The speakers before me spoke about building local capacity, and that was something we really focused on within this evaluation. We deployed local enumerators and researchers who spoke the local language and dialects and who could build rapport and trust with the local community more easily. As I mentioned before, we understood that Myanmar had a very community-centered and family-centered structure of society. So it was very important to recognize that and to embed that recognition of culture within our data collection processes. Not only did we interview the women who were receiving the cash transfers, but also the overall community in which they were functioning to understand how the cash transfer was functioning from a very holistic perspective. That knowledge, that understanding came when we understood how Myanmar's social structure worked and exactly who took decisions about food within the house, who took decisions about money within the house, and so on. And finally, we also took a step back as researchers because we were an international team. I'm from India, others were from other countries. We were working in Myanmar with local researchers as well. And we all have our own personal, perhaps even judgment and bias when we come to talk about feeding, when we come to talk about child nutrition. And we also have certain overarching frameworks which we're working with, which have been developed for a more generalized audience. Keeping our biases aside and also perhaps taking down a generalized framework and understanding the more local, the more contextual understanding of what feeding a child could mean in the Burmese context was very, very important. So we studied the social and the agroclimatic factors in Chin and Rakhine, and we exercised researcher reflexivity, and we recognized the dietary recommendations should reflect the local context, and that's what we went on to do. And eventually we did publish the report, which went on to receive a highly satisfactory rating from UNICEF as well. Diving into the second case study, this was a case study of a national evaluation of India's rural development portfolio, particularly conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic. A quick snapshot of the context in which we were working. This is, of course, set in India, wherein 68% of the Indian population live in rural areas, making rural development a very key policy priority. This was the evaluation of India's 6 flagship rural development programs, accounting for about $15 billion with field work across 12 states. So one can imagine the extent of the entire exercise, commissioned by Niti Aayog, Government of India. And the 6 programs that I'm talking about, which were evaluated nationwide across 12 states in the Indian context during the pandemic, were large scale and were a broad portfolio. It included a rural housing scheme, rural roads, several social safety nets, and it also included the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which is the world's largest public works program with about over 120 million beneficiaries. So what could potentially be some of the challenges in making this more culturally responsive? We were conducting this evaluation, this nationwide evaluation of 6 schemes in India, a large country with a diversity of cultures, ethnicities, and languages. At the same time, the evaluation had to develop findings which were representative of the national context while reflecting local nuance and cultural context.
All
We
right.
were also
Can you wrap up, please? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. We were also working with very large-scale programs, which took very different forms in different states. And there could be different definitions of jargon, such as rural development or transformation as well. So quickly going through what we did 4 broad things. We worked through a consultative approach, wherein, let's say, definitions of what rural development meant, what asset creation or transformation meant, were consultatively determined with stakeholders at the national, state, and district levels. This helped to inject cultural nuance into the entire process of evaluation framework creation. We piloted tools to adjust for cultural nuance. We understood that it is sometimes difficult to ask direct questions about identity markers such as caste or practices such as open defecation. And we created questions that led up to that so that could elicit responses better in line with socio-cultural practices. We adopted a case study approach to spotlight local innovation and socio-cultural best practices, which may otherwise have been lost in a nationwide evaluation. And overall, as many of my past speakers have described, we work with participatory principles, exemplified by regular stakeholder consultations to sense check the findings and seek feedback on the analysis. Broad 5 key takeaways, of course, was the fact that I think the reason why these evaluations were successful, even though it was one during a pandemic in India and during the ethnic conflict in Myanmar, was because we work with flexibility, adaptability. We ensure researcher or evaluator reflexivity. We work with local resources. We had an ethical and human rights focus, and we also kept the space for innovation to make it more culturally responsive. These are the 2 evaluation products that can be accessed online later on, based on what I mentioned. And with that, that's the close of my presentation. Thank you so much for this platform.
Thanks a lot, Rai. And we will love to have more information about every one of your presentations. And I think this is a very relevant topic. But unfortunately, we're very short in time. But yeah, we can open up this discussion in other spaces as well. Now, thank you, Rai. And now I will introduce to Stephen Porter. Stephen is currently a senior evaluator specialist at the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. Previously, he was a researcher associate with the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand. Sorry if I mispronounce it. And he has worked as an evaluation advisor at the Department of International Development, Oxfam at Great Britain, the African Medical and Research Foundation, and as a director with Oxfam America. He holds a PhD from the University of East Anglia and a master in public policy from the University of Cape Town. Stephen will talk a little bit about the perspectives on cultural responsive evaluation from the Independent Evaluation Group, World Bank. Welcome, Stephen. The floor is yours.
So thanks, and thanks to all the speakers that came before me. I think I'd start off by sort of disclaim I don't think we've done culturally responsive evaluation as a sort of full methodology and approach within our work. And what I'm going to discuss is how myself and some other colleagues are adapting, informed by culturally responsive approaches, and invite you to take as an example of an evaluator with connections in both colonial and colonized contexts, working in a large international organization, trying to reimagine what we're doing. And we're working on it. So an issue of evaluation is that lots of forms of existence remain invisible when viewed from an evaluator's perspective. A quote that I often think of in relation to evaluation comes from the African-American author Ralph Ellison's book, Invisible Man. I'm a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids, and I might even be able to said to possess a mind. I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me. Like a bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it is as though I have been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. As evaluators, we work with distorting glass already in place due to our position, and perhaps because we put it there ourselves. This means that some existences of people and nature become invisible to us. Engaging and employing culturally responsive evaluation can help to reshape our mirrors. And as I said, it's an area that myself and other colleagues are working on. So understanding and working in a culturally responsive evaluation is about enhancing and the rigor and specificity so that when we look back in hindsight, we get a better understanding of what's happened. And that should help us to be able to project into the future, to be able to work with foresight. And working this way should be able to help organizations and evaluators consider how issues of race, power, privilege, inequity influence evaluation processes, influence the work that we're undertaking, and affect the validity of the findings and conclusions, and hopefully improve it. Culturally responsive evaluation provides the potential to improve evaluations to produce those kind of results, and requires us to have commitment to listening, responding to diverse interests throughout the evaluation process. This is a level of practice where we're still learning to engage. So maybe just to sort of give you a little understanding of the evaluation environment in which we're looking at how we approach culturally responsive evaluation. In the World Bank, we evaluate all the way from the capital increase through potentially to loan repayment. We undertake evaluations of corporate processes, which can affect the $227 billion portfolio of the World Bank and how they deliver loans. We also undertake strategy and thematic evaluations, which cover potentially up to 107 countries, for example, in the recent COVID-19 evaluation, and a portfolio of $30 billion of expenditure. We undertake country program evaluations. For example, I've started to work on one in Ethiopia, which is potentially around $11 billion of active spending. And we also work on project evaluations, which can be between 50 and $1 billion. So I give this sort of idea to give this sort of overall context that we're not always working in one culture, we're working in multiple cultures, spanning multiple organizations, spanning multiple levels, from potentially a community up to a global level. And I guess in my work, I see the best opportunities for us to work on culturally responsive evaluation through how we extend and think about our thematic evaluations and working through entry points in our project and country programs. And I'm going to talk about some opportunities we started to see in our practice. So the first opportunity, and this is an example of an evaluation where I think we've started to think about, we show sort of more culturally responsive ways of thinking, is a colleague who, Lauren Kelly, evaluated with a big team spreading across the Sahel and other colleagues in IEG of the Great Green Wall. This is a piece of work where basically the greening of the Sahel is being undertaken. And this hasn't been evaluated as sort of overall project or program before. And within this, they employed ethnographic approaches and started to develop deeper relations with contextually based evaluators, starting to think through connections to the culture. And this helped to understand that the projects, although it hadn't been evaluated, but were claiming sort of massive greening, which was also true, but also started to show how the greening had instigated land disputes and changes in social structure beyond the projects. And the sort of bottom left-hand corner of the screen there, with that concrete pillar, shows where land had started to be claimed because of the greening. So through this, we started to be able to look more at unintended effects, those sort of unintended bigger effects that we often don't look at. A second part is that opportunity is that we're reimagining our work in a rhizome. So what does this mean? So I've started to be informed by the meta of a sort of rhizome, which is a biological term to describe how the roots of flowers grow in all directions. They knot together and they sustain each other. And if we think about evaluation in a rhizomatic form, we can start to think about humans and beyond humans interact with existing structures and how change grows, propagates in a nomadic fashion, where connections are made from any one point of activity to any other point of activity. Working this way is starting to help us think about how we connect different evaluation approaches in that large portfolio and different types of evaluations. So practically, this can help us rethink practice. For example, in conducting a large thematic evaluation across 107 countries, we can start to look for opportunities to connect with partners, develop modules where we can apply culturally responsive approaches, while also applying the broader approaches that help us understand such a large scope, such as data science techniques and bringing together synthesis. And in summary, I think the last thing that the opportunity that we're looking at is that we need to reimagine evaluation practice. So that means that we need to connect with different types of partners. And something I started to do previously and in my work is working, for example, with the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation at the University of Illinois. And this is maybe just a bit of a punt out for their annual conference, which I found incredibly engaging and useful to start to think about how to connect those large scopes with project-specific scopes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. It was great timing. So we have a few questions, and now we are opening the floor to all the speakers. We have one question that it's addressed to everyone. On participatory approaches, did you involve local community members in the design of the research, the question, the interviews? How did you dispatch these findings? I don't know who wants to answer this. We also have another one. This is actually for Claudia. Could you give an example of local approaches that in your experience have helped to apply the principles of cultural responsive evaluation / feminist evaluation?
Yes, well, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. And I would just like to address very quickly the past one, so we won't leave it there. I didn't share research itself, but I have been in my evaluation practice trying to incorporate community right holders in every step of the evaluation. However, the design part becomes the most challenging one just because of the contract issuing team in the field and all the logistics around an evaluation. So I've been challenging, and the teams that I work with, challenging with that inclusion, with space inclusion in the design, but sure, it's something to work towards. And also what has been very important and very valuable is to incorporate the views of community members into the analysis of the data. If I had to recommend something, I would surely recommend that, because it opens your mind as an evaluator very widely and gives you lots of insights. Regarding the second question, I'm very quick because I don't want to take the time from my colleagues. There are approaches that are very interesting in terms of they're very mind openers to understand what are people's expectations regarding an intervention, or even regarding development and its results, that have been very important to me. I've just put a quick example. In the Andean communities in Ecuador, in Bolivia, and in general in indigenous communities in this part of the world, they have this concept about buen vivir. That means something like living well, if you can help me with that translation, Gabi. When I've made a few evaluations regarding sustainable development and tried to install a parallel between this buen vivir and the sustainable development, and it's not very clear. So it's very important that we try to use their own, the community conceptions and their dreams and their expectations about our work, to understand and to value how the intervention was able to incorporate that into the valuing of the results and the products and eventually and the impact, depending on each evaluation. That's
Thanks
a must.
lot. Thanks a lot, Claudia. And I have one question that I don't know who can actually address, maybe Stephen or even Dugan. How open are evaluation commissioners to culturally responsive evaluation approaches and related resourcing?
Stephen, do you want to give that a go, or should I jump in?
I mean, maybe just a sort of. Okay, so what I understand from the broader perspective in the US, I think commissioners are being influenced by, especially regional evaluation associations, which are highlighting the importance of culturally responsive and sort of developing evaluation principles and standards linked to the context, which should be followed. So I think there's an influence. I mean, maybe just a sort of caveat from the World Bank perspective, our commissioning process in the IG is that we set the questions, so we don't sort of commission externally or ask external evaluators. We work through teams of internal evaluators, and I think we are open, and it's an area that we're developing in our evaluation practice to sort of reach out and sort of understand culturally responsive and take note of and be responsible through our evaluation practices, especially linked to local evaluation guidance. Dugan, I think you'd be able to give a much better perspective of the sort of broader ecosystem of changes.
I don't know that that's necessarily true, but let me just do a little quick, we're kind of nearly out of time, but I think commissioners of evaluation and users of evidence are persuaded by quality and rigor. And I think culturally responsive evaluation can be both persuasive and rigorous. And it's our job as evaluators to do it in a way that sells it, because you know, an evaluation that is not culturally responsive is a bad evaluation, and the evidence that it gives rise to is tainted. And so we have to be saying to people that culturally responsive evaluation is better evaluation. It's good evaluation. it makes for a more meaningful evidence base. And I think we have to be persuasive and convincing about that case.
Thanks a lot. That was actually kind of addressed another question, but I will just make it out loud. And if anyone can answer it in less than 1 minute, that would be great. And this is actually, despite the need to use local knowledge, the question is raised about its validity, and it is new, and therefore the finding is questioned. How can we ensure the evidence receives attention?
These are the big questions, right?
Yeah.
These are this is the big challenge facing evaluators, is we have to produce material that is persuasive, that is influential, that changes minds. And that means meeting your reader, your commissioner, your user where they are at. And that's our job. You know, it's really a question of our ability to see the world through the eyes of the people for whom we are producing evidence. And that is a major shift, because the people increasingly who need to use the evidence are not in Washington. They're not in New York. They're in Kigali. They're in Honiara. Do you know what I mean? Like, we need to bring power back to where it needs to be wielded.
Thanks a lot, Dugan. That's actually a great challenge for all of us. And with this, I will thank you all for your amazing presentation. It was very insightful. I learned a lot. And thanks to all the speakers. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. And please remember to spread the word about the Young and Emerging Evaluators competition on this particular topic. We'll be posting all the call and how to submit applications and in our social media, but now we have it as well in the chat. So thanks a lot. And thank you for joining us in this G-Local event.
And don't forget about the competition.
Yeah. Submit your proposals.
Thanks very much. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.